Well, the breaking news of the night is that Special Prosecutor Jack Smith has invoked the crime fraud exception in a motion to force one of Donald Trump's lawyers to testify to a grand jury without being able to refuse to answer questions because of the attorney-client privilege. The crime fraud exception can overrule the attorney-client privilege. The New York Times is reporting tonight federal prosecutors overseeing the investigation into former President Donald J. Trump's handling of classified documents are seeking to pierce assertions of attorney-client privilege and compel one of his lawyers to answer more questions before a grand jury, according to two people familiar with the matter, adding an aggressive new dimension to the inquiry and underscoring the legal peril facing Mr. Trump. The prosecutors have sought approval from a federal judge to invoke what is known as the crime fraud exception, which allows them to work around attorney-client privilege when they have reason to believe that legal advice or legal services have been used in furthering a crime. The fact that prosecutors invoked the exception in a sealed motion to compel the testimony of the lawyer Evan Corcoran suggests that they believe Mr. Trump or his allies might have used Mr. Corcoran's services in that way. Evan Corcoran is the lawyer who met with federal investigators last June and handed over more than 30 government documents in response to a Justice Department subpoena served on Donald Trump. At that time, another Trump lawyer, Christina Bobb, signed a statement swearing that they had conducted what they called a diligent search. That was their phrase, a diligent search for all government documents in Donald Trump's possession at his Florida home. That statement was written by Evan Corcoran, and that statement proved to be false. 6 weeks later, the FBI executed a search warrant at the same property where the Trump lawyers swore in writing there were no more documents, and the FBI found more than 100 additional classified documents and several hundred additional government documents that were illegally in Donald Trump's possession. The search warrant used by the FBI that day said there was, quote, probable cause to believe that evidence of obstruction of justice would be found. The New York Times reports tonight it was also not immediately clear whether the Justice Department suspects misconduct by Mr. Corcoran and Mr. Trump, by Mr. Trump and others, or by Mr. Trump alone. So the big news of the night is that Jack Smith is telling a federal judge that he so strongly suspects that Donald Trump's lawyer was somehow involved in criminal conduct, that that lawyer should be compelled to testify under oath in a grand jury without the protection of attorney-client privilege. Another witness Jack Smith has subpoenaed for grand jury testimony has announced he will refuse to testify. Mike Pence, the first former vice president in history to be subpoenaed in a criminal investigation to give under oath testimony to a grand jury about the president he served, announced today that he will make the single most preposterous legal claim ever made by a vice president of the United States. Multiple media outlets are reporting tonight that Mike Pence will cite the Constitution's speech and debate clause as a reason that he will not have to answer any questions under oath to a grand jury. You will hear from the country's reigning scholarly authority on matters of constitutional law, Harvard Law professor Laurence Tribe, about this in just a moment. But as the only person you will hear from tonight who used to work in the United States Senate, I'm going to take what they call in the Senate a point of personal privilege to offer you the very clear reason that I see why the speech and debate clause cannot possibly apply to the Vice President of the United States. Here is the speech and debate clause in its entirety. The senators and representatives shall receive a compensation for their services to be ascertained by law and paid out of the Treasury of the United States. They shall, in all cases except treason, felony, and breach of the peace, be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of their respective houses and in going to and returning from the same, and for any speech or debate in either house. They shall not be questioned in any other place. For the moment, my analysis will rest on the first word of the clause, the senators. The clause applies to, as the first words indicate, the senators and representatives. The Vice President of the United States, by no definition, is a United States Senator. The Vice President of the United States, unlike every member of the United States Senate, does not have the power to introduce legislation in the Senate. The Vice President of the United States is not allowed to vote on over 99% of the votes held in the United States Senate. The fact that the Vice President of the United States is only allowed to vote to break a tie in the Senate does not make the Vice President a senator. It makes the Vice President something more like a judge in a courtroom who comes down on one side or the other of arguments made by the lawyers in the courtroom who are in no way the equal of the judge in the courtroom, nor is the judge the equal of the lawyers in the courtroom. The Vice President of the United States is not allowed to vote on impeachments in the United States Senate. The Vice President of the United States is not allowed to vote on treaties in the United States Senate, which can never be stuck in a tie vote because they require two-thirds majority to pass. The Vice President of the United States is not allowed to vote in what has become the single most common vote in the United States Senate, cloture votes, which require 60 votes. The Vice President of the United States is not allowed to be a member of a Senate committee. When the Senate Majority Leader appoints Senate conferees to conference committees with the House of Representatives to work out the final language of legislation, the Vice President cannot be one of those conferees because the Vice President is not a senator. I could go on and on about the powers, rights, and privileges that belong to each United States senator, none of which belong to the Vice President. And conversely, no senator has a single power or right that the Vice President has. Not one. Every member of the United States Senate is sworn in with an oath of office on the Senate floor. The Vice President is sworn in on the Capitol steps with the President on Inauguration Day. Only in a universe poisoned by Donald Trump could any adults be involved in a conversation in the 21st century about the difference between a United States Senator and the Vice President of the United States. The poisoning of Mike Pence by Donald Trump has offered Mike Pence countless humiliations, and so Mike Pence, who left his capacity for embarrassment somewhere in 2015, will now take on the embarrassment of being the only Vice President in history who does not know that he was never a United States Senator.